very interesting things, such as Shem, which is the son of Noah. He lived for several hundred years after the flood, and he was actually living at the same time as Abraham. So if you look at the numbers and the ages in which they live, you put on a graph, Abraham was alive, or I should say Shem was alive still hundreds of years later. We talked about why that was, because of prior to the flood, there was a shell of water around the earth that protected the people and animals and stuff like that. So anyway, I want to encourage you to go look back at last Sunday mornings if you're interested in that kind of topic. So with Bible chronology, you can put together, if I may say, numbers don't lie, as we looked at last week, and you can look at some specifics and figure out some things that you wouldn't maybe normally do. Okay, there's certain also perceptions we have. So if I can just ask this, you don't have to answer out loud or anything, but you keep the number in your head. But what age do you think David was when he killed Goliath? Okay, just maybe a rough age in your head, or what do you imagine David to be? Is he an older young man, or is he a boy? I mean, what is the image that you have had placed in your head, or what you imagine it to be? So remember that number, pick a number of an age in your head. And then also this question, how old? So Jonathan and David were best friends. It's one of the friendships in the Bible that's notable because of the sacrifice that Jonathan was willing to give to David, because his dad was king, but he wasn't going to be able to be king because his dad kind of ruined that for him. How much was Jonathan older? Were they the same age? And then Jonathan was older, by how much? Do you picture them as being contemporary, like 5, 6 years apart? So we're going to answer some of those questions. Again, this is just kind of using the chronology and just some interesting things, and hopefully it's fun for you to learn some Bible things, some facts this way. So again, how old do you imagine David to be when he killed Goliath? Most imagine him to be anywhere from 10 to 14. So we're going to use chronology to find out approximately. Most paintings portray him as being very, very young. He looks like he could be 12, 13, 14. Here's a painting that pictures him as like, I don't know, a scrawny 9-year-old. Okay, here's a cartoon, of course, somewhat small. Here's another one. A lot of the cartoons, of course, picture him very, very small. And I just included this because here's the blonde version of David. Okay, David was a Jew. He would have had darker olive skin, and not like, well, you weren't around back then, but it's kind of interesting. But you look at what a Jewish person and the people back at that time, you do have in the Song of Solomon, it describes Solomon, his son, and the kind of complexion of their skin, the color of it, and their dark curly hair. Okay, so David would have most likely been like every other Jewish person with that kind of complexion. So anyway, going on. And again, we've asked this question, how old is Jonathan when David killed Goliath? Is Jonathan in his 20s? Is he just a few years older than David? Here are some pictures or paintings that portray them as being fairly, contemporary means being alive at the same time, but fairly close in age. The taller one in most cases being Jonathan. Here's a cartoon which shows Jonathan on the right giving his armor to David. It looks like they're a couple of years apart. So here are some verses that may make him, David, sound younger to our 2024 ears. Now, again, we're examining all of the verses. I'm not leaving a couple out. I'm trying to put all of them together so that we can see this. So here in 1 Samuel 17, and the king said, "Inquire thou whose son this stripling is." He's referring to David. Now, stripling to us may seem like a toddler or like, a 10-year-old. Stripling simply means young man, not a toddler or a boy. It's taken from, I don't know this off the top of my head. I'm going to research it. And you look at the derivation of the word, and stripling comes from an older English word for strip, or a small tree, okay, a sapling. And for Samuel 17 below, verse 58, and Saul said to him, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." So you see, in just 2 verses, he refers to him as a young man, the bottom verse. So stripling is just another name for a teenager or a young man. When Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, now this is the full story, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. I just wanted to show you the underlining portion there. The word stripling is youth, and in 2 verses later is young man. So there's quite a difference between that of a boy, and a young man in his youth. So this brings up the question that the word youth is used by Saul, and it's used throughout the Bible. Does the word youth give us a specific age range? It actually does. So I want to show you this here. And Saul said to David, either by the usage of it in context or its definition. Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth. Okay? And he, a man of war from his youth. So we try to, as much as possible, we use only Bible for definitions, not preconceived ideas. We don't need that. The Bible should give us all the information. And if, by the way, if you're wondering, you're looking for something and the Bible doesn't give the amount of information, we don't have to make apologies for it. God gives us the information that he deems fit that we need for whatever it is. And if it's not in there, it's not in there. Okay? So, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Matthew 19, notice the young man saith unto him, all these things have I kept from my youth up. What lack I yet? Now the context of Matthew 19:20 is the rich young ruler coming to Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ talks to him about keeping the law. And he says, all these things have I kept from my youth up. So I want to be careful here because the Bible doesn't have an example that I know of something called the bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah, bar meaning son of, mitzvah is the law. Okay, but if it's something that has been practiced throughout the centuries, we do see some correlation here though. He says, all these things have I kept from my youth up. From his youth, he would have been able to look adults in the eye and be able to talk to them and a much different relationship than a boy. So it's kind of like at the age of 12, 13, they moved to a kind of an age of maturity that they moved past and they're able to have a different status, I guess you could say. So all these things have I kept from my youth up, what lack I yet? A youth would be in his teens, anywhere from 13 to 19. So notice this, and when he, Jesus Christ, was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And in verse 49 of that same chapter, he said unto them, how is it that ye sought me? Okay, if you're familiar with this, Joseph and Mary thought that he was with them. They realized he wasn't. They run all the way back to Jerusalem. They're looking for him everywhere, and they're like, so she asked them, where were you? He said unto them, how is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? Now, something took place at this time that the realization, in fact, I don't have the rest of it on here. I'm just going to turn to it and read this out loud. So Luke chapter 2 and verse 49. How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? In other words, know ye not. And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. So something had taken place. He talked to them somewhat differently than he had before. At this point, it seems was his understanding of what his purpose was, his life. Okay, so it's 12 years old. Now, as you know, the Psalms have many, many prophetic passages referring to the Messiah. So in Psalm 88, we're going to read this one. It says, I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. While I suffer thy terrors, I am distracted. In Psalm 88, it mentions from the youth, which is, right past your boyhood and beginning of your youth. So from my youth up, why does it say I'm afflicted and ready to die from my youth up? If Jesus Christ, the realization God speaks to him when he's there in the temple for those 3 days, reveals to him, Jesus Christ, his purpose, why he's here, that he is the Messiah, and that someday he's going to give his life for the sins of humanity. Can you imagine a 12-year-old boy? He realizes that. So no doubt this is causing obviously some, if I may call it stress. I am afflicted. You can imagine, wow, I'm going to be separated from God someday? I'm going to die for the sins of humanity. As you know, when Jesus Christ approached that time, he said, Father, if it's your will, if it's possible, take this cup from me. Okay, Jesus Christ wanted to die for humanity. He needed to, but if there was any other way, but there's not. So at the age of, it says here, when he was 12, so 12 to close to 13 possibly, he realizes this, God reveals it to him, and Psalms mentions prophetically 1,000 years in the future his realization. But when did he realize it? From his youth. After that, he knew what it was his purpose. So at the age of 12, possibly close to 13, Jesus knew who he was and his purpose. The point of this is, this helps us to define what youth is by looking at evidence, multiple witnesses, verses in the Bible. Yet the following verses help us to see he is not too young. So here's some, I'll just kind of name some of the incidences. Near the time of the killing of Goliath, David was Saul's armor bearer. 10-year-old boy, not likely be able to bear that armor, especially the skinny kid that we saw in one of the previous paintings. David was tall enough, at least for the following, to not be ridiculous. Saul armed David with his armor, and he put on a helmet of brass upon his head, and also he armed him with a coat of mail. If he's 10, this would seem like a cruel joke. Shortly after killing Goliath, within a few years, David married Michal. Okay, so not a 10-year-old. And made him a leader in military battles. Saul set him over the men of war. So in just a few years, David was able to lift a very large sword of Goliath. Would a 10 or 12-year-old boy be in charge of a sheep by himself? Now, this doesn't prove anything necessarily, but you add up the incidences and it seems to lean very strongly in the direction of being an older young man. Actually, some of them are, when it says it's his youth, it's not a 10-year-old boy. And David said unto Saul, thy servant had kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him and smote him. So putting it all together, David's minimum age, old enough, big enough to handle the previous things we mentioned, that within a few years he was handling everything required of an adult male, marriage and war. Most likely in his upper teens, at the time he killed Goliath, possibly 18, maybe 19, maybe 17. Don't know. But much older than a 10-year-old boy. Much different picture than a tiny, there's even a song, only a boy named David, only a little sling. Only a boy named David, but he could pray and sing. And so you sing in Sunday school, but it even gives the idea of a small boy with a tiny little sling. The sling is a whole other thing, that these things were weapons of war. The archaeologists have dug up skeletons with holes in their skull. They know were from slings. These things were not just kind of pew, pew. These were dangerous weapons in the hands of David, who had practice in slinging them at predators to keep the sheep safe. So not something for a younger, too young of a boy. So anyway, by these, it would seem David was much older, but still in his teens. Is there a way to find out for sure? Well, so we're going to the maximum age. The Bible always gives the clues. From 20, here's a verse in Numbers, God's directive. From 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. So it's numbered at 20 to be able to go forth to war. Most likely, David returned from, you're going to have to go back in some of the memory, I guess, if you remember this, but I'm putting all of the story together. David returned from playing the harp before Saul. So Saul was stressed out. There was actually, you read it, there was a demon that was harassing him because Saul was angry. He had some anger issues. And anyway, so at the playing, this is another verse that we use when it comes to the kind of music. So David was playing pleasant harp music, and it drove the spiritual demons away. Music is very powerful. Music, the kind of music attracts or dispels demons. But that's not the point we're looking at here today. So most likely David, returning from playing the harp before Saul and being his armor bearer in training, wasn't able yet to go into battle because he was strong enough to handle the armor in order to tend to the sheep while all his older brothers, age 20 and above, are fighting in the war against the Philistines. Okay, so David comes to see to take some cheese and some stuff from his dad for his brothers. He's not in the battle. If he was 20, he would have been. Okay. Notice, and Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. So David comes down and goes, hey, what's going to be done? Here's Goliath. What is anyone doing anything about this? And Eliab's anger was kindled against David and said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. If David were 20 years of age, which would mean you're of age to go to war, and you have to be, and you're supposed to be in battle, this would not have seemed so ridiculous. In other words, what are you doing here? I'm 20. He doesn't say that. So David wasn't necessarily supposed to be there unless he's simply taking some food for his brothers. Brothers are at war. He's not. But he's Saul's armor bearer, yet he's not able to go forth to war. In a few years, he's married. He's in war. So when he kills Goliath here in this setting, 18, 19, maybe he's 19 even. And it depends on how closely these things happen. So David was not yet 20 at the killing of Goliath, but within a few months or years he was in war, commanding men, and married. So these are the things you can learn with chronology. We haven't looked at some of the graphs yet, but this question, how old is Jonathan? We asked when David killed Goliath. Is Jonathan in his 20s? Just a few years older than David. So Jonathan must have been at least, now we're going to look at some specifics here. Jonathan must be at least 20 years old to be able to go to war. Okay, now here we're going to back up in time. So Saul reigned 1 year. So we're backing up prior to the battle or David killing Goliath. This is years prior. Saul just becomes king. He reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof, notice, 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah. Now the point of this is, Jonathan here has to be at least 20. Doesn't give us an exact age, but we can have minimum and maximum. You go too old and things just don't, they all break down. So we'll see here. So again, from 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. And here, verse 2, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, 1,000 were with Jonathan. Jonathan is a warrior at this time. So Jonathan must have been at least 20 to be at war. So here we look at the life of Jonathan. Okay, 20 years old and upward, there's 20. And then it says at the bottom, when he, Saul, had reigned 2 years over Israel. So you see, this gives us a minimum age of Jonathan. And we're just starting off with this. You can play around with this, but I'm going to skip that around, because if we go too old for Jonathan, well, then it doesn't make any sense. So I'll show you why here. So here's the life of Jonathan. Here's the reign of Saul. Okay, now let's do this. This now limits the age of Saul. If Saul's too young to be married, it's highly unlikely. So 20 years old would be the most likely if consistent with others in the Bible and in that culture. So in other words, Saul, we add up here the life of Saul. It's kind of, hopefully you can see this, but if Saul is 20 years old when he has Jonathan, and so Jonathan is his oldest son, that would obviously make in 20 years, you see the life of Saul, if Saul is 40 roughly, then Jonathan would be 20 and able to go forth to war. At that time, Saul has reigned for 2 years, and his son Jonathan is in the military. So, after it says, and any older would make Saul a very old king when he died. He reigned for 40 years. So, we'll see the numbers here in a bit, but you see there, if you add 40 years of a reign, Saul is 80 to 85 to 90 when he is in battle, which becomes far less likely. Okay, so Saul, I want to show you numbers. If your numbers bore you, I apologize, but this has to be proof, okay? Saul has to be around 20 to marry. Saul has Jonathan, his oldest son. 20 years later, Jonathan is able to go to war in the second year of Saul's reign, which puts Saul at around 39 to 40 years old. Add 40 years of Saul's reign, and Saul is close to 80. Okay, so, let's be around 20, make sure I got everything here. All right, so we add the reign of Saul an additional 40 years, and we have Saul at 78, and Jonathan, at the time that he dies, is close to 60 years old. Now we're going to put this together with the life of David and add this up, okay? So what we do with the Bible, we look for corresponding parts that come together. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. Okay, so Saul dies at the end of 40 years of his reign. David begins to reign, and he's 30 years old. So we look for a convergence of numbers. Where does the Bible give us clues or overlaps different ages? So again, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. Acts 13:21 gives us the clue all the way in the New Testament. Afterward, they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul, the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. So here again, if you can see this, the reign of Saul is 40 years. He reigned 40 years, and then he dies. And if at the end of that reign, he dies and he's 78, that would be still within a range that's normal before he dies, and allowing him to give birth to Jonathan at 20, and Jonathan and King Saul all to be within this range. Anything higher becomes abnormal or impossible. Now we add the life of David, and David is, notice, 30 years old at the time that Saul died, after 40 years of his reign. This means that Jonathan would have been in his upper 20s or to low 30s when David was born. Okay, did you get that? When David was born, Jonathan would be already close to 30 years old. Hardly a boyhood friend. Very, very different picture. So this means that Jonathan was not David's older but close to the same age big buddy, pictured in previous frames. He was more of a father figure, an older brother or mentor that took David under his wing. So again, you add all of these up, and let's put the date, age. So we have the life of David. How old did we say he was, roughly, when he battled Goliath? 18, 19, let's say. So we put this graph, we have 3 years of possibility, move it all the way up to the life of Jonathan, and Jonathan would have been in his early to mid 40s as a mentor to David. Okay, again, hardly the image that are often given to us in paintings or that we're led to believe. So simply by using Bible chronology, the numbers that God gives you, you can see all of these details. So while David's brothers, quick summary, while David's brothers were at war, David tended sheep. He was not yet 20 and in the army. But within a short time of killing Goliath, he was married and in the military at 20. He couldn't have been too young. Jesse would not have allowed a 10 or 12-year-old boy to tend sheep and fight off lions and bears, I'm assuming. These factors limited his age at the killing of Goliath. Okay, so anyway, this is just kind of some neat, if I may, I think it's really really kind of cool, kind of neat to see some of these numbers. When you look at the numbers that are given to you and you add them up, particular ages, and put them on a graph, the numbers don't lie. So again, what you have is David, not a 10-year-old boy when he's killing Goliath, his upper teens, and Jonathan, who befriends him, becomes his mentor. He's not his boyhood pal. He's not the same age. He is twice his age. He could be his dad as far as age goes, or a bigger brother that takes him under his wing, and it gives you a much different understanding of the life and the scenario and a richer understanding of the picture from the Bible. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. We thank you again, Lord, just for all you do for us. Thank you for these just amazing things we can look at that are, at the very least, call it trivia, but gives us and helps us to delve into and understand the inner workings of your word and the lives of the people at these times. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.